The handcuffs clicked shut around my wrists as the fake police officer smiled with satisfaction. Karen stood behind him, recording everything on her phone, her face glowing with triumph. She had finally done it. After months of harassment and threats, she had found a way to have me arrested in front of the entire neighborhood. "You should have just followed the rules," she whispered, stepping closer with that smug expression I had grown to despise. "Now everyone will see what happens to troublemakers in our community." What Karen did not know was that those handcuffs felt familiar. I had used the same brand hundreds of times in my career. What she also did not know was that impersonating a federal officer is a felony. And what she did not know was that she had just committed multiple federal crimes against someone who carries real federal authority. I looked directly into her camera and smiled. That is when I realized Karen had no idea who she was dealing with. After 15 years of chasing dangerous fugitives across state lines and serving high-risk federal warrants, I thought I had earned some peace. The suburbs of Maplewood Heights seemed like the perfect place to disappear from the chaos of my work as a U.S. Marshal. Clean streets, manicured lawns, and the kind of quiet that only comes from neighborhoods where people mind their own business. Or so I thought. The moving truck had barely pulled away from my new driveway when she appeared. Karen Hensley stood at the edge of my property line, clipboard in hand, watching my every move like a hawk circling prey. She wore a navy blue polo shirt with some kind of official-looking badge pinned to the chest, and her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail that made her face look permanently stern. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, but her tone suggested anything but welcome. "I am Karen, the neighborhood watch captain and HOA compliance coordinator. I just wanted to make sure you understand our community standards." I had dealt with hardened criminals who were more pleasant than this woman, but I was tired, and all I wanted was to get my boxes inside and maybe enjoy a quiet evening in my new home. So I smiled and played nice. "Thanks, I am sure everything will be fine." Karen scribbled something on her clipboard, then looked up at me with those calculating eyes. "What kind of work do you do? We like to know about our neighbors, especially when they move in with so much equipment." She gestured toward my truck, which admittedly looked more tactical than typical moving vehicles. Years of federal work had taught me to be prepared for anything, and my vehicle reflected that reality. But to Karen, it probably looked suspicious. "Government work," I said, keeping it vague. The last thing I wanted was to advertise my real profession to someone who thrived on drama and conflict. That answer seemed to satisfy her for the moment, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. Karen was the type of person who needed to know everything about everyone, and my vague response had only made me more interesting to her. Over the next few days, I learned more about Karen than I ever wanted to know. She had lived in Maplewood Heights for 12 years, and in that time, she had appointed herself the unofficial ruler of our quiet suburban kingdom. Every morning at exactly 7 a.m., she would begin her patrol of the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, looking for violations of the HOA rules that she seemed to know by heart. The other neighbors spoke about her in hushed tones, like prisoners discussing a particularly cruel warden. Mrs. Peterson from 3 houses down told me that Karen had forced the Martinez family to repaint their entire house because the shade of beige was 2% off from the approved color palette. The Johnsons had received 17 violation notices in 1 month for various infractions ranging from leaving their garbage cans out 15 minutes too long to having a welcome mat that was 3 inches wider than regulations allowed. But it was the way Karen looked at my house that told me I was about to become her next project. Every morning, She would stand at the end of my driveway, studying my property like a general planning an assault. She would take pictures of my mailbox, measure the height of my grass with a ruler, and make detailed notes about the position of my car in the driveway. Then came the first violation notice. I found it tucked under my windshield wiper on a Tuesday morning, printed on official-looking letterhead that proclaimed MAPLEWOOD HEIGHTS HOMOWNERS Association Violation Notice. According to Karen, my moving boxes had been visible from the street for more than 48 hours, which violated Section 4.7 of the Community Guidelines regarding unsightly storage of personal items. The fine was $25. I stared at that piece of paper and felt something familiar stirring in my chest. It was the same feeling I got when a case was about to get complicated, when someone was playing games they did not understand. Karen had just made her first mistake. She had chosen the wrong target. The violation notices came like clockwork after that first one. Every morning brought a new complaint, a new fine, a new excuse for Karen to assert her authority over my life. My mailbox was positioned 2 inches too far from the curb. My grass was 1/8 of an inch above the maximum allowed height. My car was parked at an angle that created an unsightly appearance from the street. Each notice was more ridiculous than the last, but they all had one thing in common. They were issued by someone who believed she had unlimited power to control every aspect of her neighbors' lives. What made it worse was watching Karen ignore identical violations committed by her friends and allies. The Hendersons had grass twice as long as mine, but they never received a notice. Mrs. Cromwell had been parking her RV in her driveway for 3 weeks, which violated multiple HOA rules, but Karen never said a word about it. It became obvious that Karen was not enforcing the rules. She was waging a personal campaign against someone she saw as a threat to her authority. The turning point came on a Saturday morning in late September. I was outside watering my small garden when Karen appeared at my property line, this time with backup. She had brought along 3 other neighbors, all holding clipboards of their own, all wearing the same stern expressions that seemed to be the unofficial uniform of Karen's inner circle. "We need to talk," Karen announced, as if she were calling a board meeting. "There have been complaints about your behavior in this community." I turned off the water and faced the group. In my years as a federal agent, I had learned to read people quickly, and what I saw in Karen's supporters was not conviction. It was fear. These people were not here because they agreed with Karen. They were here because they were terrified of becoming her next target. "What kind of complaints?" I asked, keeping my voice calm and neutral. Karen consulted her clipboard with the dramatic flair of someone reading from a sacred text. "Failure to maintain property standards, suspicious activities at unusual hours, refusal to provide adequate information about your employment, and general noncompliance with community values." Suspicious activities at unusual hours. That was rich. My job required me to leave early and return late sometimes, depending on federal cases. But to Karen, having an unpredictable schedule was evidence of criminal behavior. "I work for the government," I said again. "Sometimes that means irregular hours." "What kind of government work?" Karen pressed, stepping closer to my property line. "We have a right to know if we are living next to someone dangerous." The irony was almost too much to handle. Here was a woman who spent her days terrorizing her neighbors, questioning whether I was dangerous. But I kept my composure and gave her the same vague answer I had before. That is when Karen played her first real card. "If you cannot provide adequate information about your background and employment, We will have no choice but to contact the proper authorities, she said, her voice taking on an official tone that would have been funny if it were not so pathetic. We have connections with law enforcement, and we will not hesitate to use them if necessary. The three neighbors behind her shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this conversation was taking. But Karen was just getting started. We also have documentation of multiple HOA violations, which could result in significant fines and potential legal action, she continued. Unless you are willing to comply with our community standards and provide the transparency we require, we will be forced to take more serious measures. I had heard threats before, real threats from people who had the power to back them up. Karen's attempt at intimidation felt like a child playing dress-up with adult clothes, but what concerned me was not her empty threats. It was the gleam in her eyes, the way she seemed to be enjoying this confrontation. Karen was not just a busybody neighbor with too much time on her hands. She was someone who derived genuine pleasure from having power over others, even if that power was completely manufactured. After the group left, I stood in my driveway for a long time, thinking about what had just happened. In my professional life, I dealt with people who broke federal laws, who crossed state lines to avoid justice, and who made choices that put them on the wrong side of the system. But I had never encountered someone quite like Corinne. She was not breaking laws, at least not yet. She was operating in the gray area between legitimate authority and harassment, using the HOA rules as weapons in a personal war she had declared on anyone who refused to submit to her control. That night I made a decision that would change everything. I opened my laptop and began what I do best: investigation. 15 years of federal law enforcement had taught me that every criminal eventually leaves a trail. Karen might not have been robbing banks or trafficking drugs, but her pattern of behavior was just as predictable as any repeat offender I had ever tracked. I started with public records, property transfers, court filings, and complaints filed with local authorities. What I found was fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. Karen had lived in 3 different communities over the past 20 years, and in each one she had held some kind of self-appointed authority position. Homeowners Association board member, neighborhood watch captain, community safety coordinator. And in each community, she had eventually been forced out. The first was a condo complex in Arizona, where Karen had been sued by 4 different residents for harassment and selective enforcement of building rules. The case had been settled out of court, but the public records showed a pattern of complaints about Karen's aggressive tactics and personal vendettas against neighbors she disliked. The second was a suburban neighborhood in Colorado, where Karen had been removed from her position as HOA president after an investigation revealed financial irregularities in her handling of community funds. Again, the matter had been resolved quietly, but the documentation painted a clear picture of someone who saw authority positions as opportunities for personal gain and control. Now she was here in Maplewood Heights, and she had learned from her previous experiences. This time, she had not bothered with official positions or elections. She had simply declared herself the neighborhood authority and dared anyone to challenge her. But Karen had made one crucial mistake. She had chosen to target someone who knew how to build a case. Over the next few weeks, I began reaching out to other neighbors, not as the suspicious newcomer Karen had painted me as, but as someone who was genuinely concerned about the direction our community was heading. What I discovered was a neighborhood living in fear. The Petersons told me about the time Karen had reported them to code enforcement for having a small vegetable garden in their backyard, claiming it violated aesthetic standards. The report had been false, but they had spent 3 months and $1,500 fighting the citation. The Martinez family shared their story about being forced to repaint their house 3 times because Karen kept claiming the color was not approved, even though they had documentation proving otherwise. They had eventually given up and painted it white, even though they hated it, because they could not afford to keep fighting. Young couple Sarah and Mike Chen told me about Karen's campaign to have their small dog declared a nuisance animal because it barked when other dogs walked by their house. Karen had filed noise complaints with the city, organized a petition among neighbors, and even suggested that the dog might be dangerous because it was a mixed breed of unknown origin. Each story followed the same pattern. Karen would identify a target, usually someone who was new to the neighborhood or who had somehow drawn her attention. She would then begin a campaign of systematic harassment, using HOA rules, city ordinances, and social pressure to make their lives miserable until they either submitted to her authority or moved away. But the most disturbing revelation came from Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who had lived in the neighborhood for 30 years. She told me about Karen's role as the unofficial HOA treasurer and how community funds seemed to disappear into projects that benefited Karen's friends, while necessary repairs were delayed or ignored. She approved $8,000 for new landscaping around the community center, Mrs. Patterson explained, but the company that did the work was owned by her brother-in-law, and the work was terrible. Half the plants died within a month. Did anyone question the expense? I asked. Oh, honey, you do not question Karen, Mrs. Patterson said with a sad smile. People who ask too many questions become her next target. That was when I realized Karen was not just a neighborhood bully. She was potentially committing actual crimes. Misappropriation of community funds, fraud, possibly even money laundering, depending on how deep her financial schemes went. I had started this investigation to protect myself from harassment. Now I was looking at something much bigger. The breakthrough came when I connected with Tom Bradley, a neighbor who lived 4 streets over and had been quietly documenting Karen's behavior for over a year. Tom was a retired accountant who had grown suspicious of Karen's financial dealings and had been keeping detailed records of discrepancies in HOA spending. "I have been waiting for someone like you," Tom said when we met at a coffee shop across town. "Someone who is not afraid of her and who might know what to do with this information." Tom opened a thick folder filled with bank statements, invoices, receipts, and correspondence. The pattern was clear and damning. Karen had been systematically stealing from the community association for at least 2 years, using fake invoices and inflated contractor bills to funnel money into accounts controlled by her family members. The total amount was approaching $50,000. "This is enough for federal charges," I told Tom, though I did not explain how I knew that. Wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy. She could be looking at serious prison time. Tom smiled for the first time since I had met him. "Then we have her." Not quite yet, I thought, but we were getting close. Karen's behavior became increasingly erratic as October turned into November. The violation notices were arriving daily now, sometimes multiple notices for the same alleged infraction. My mailbox positioning was a recurring crisis that required constant monitoring and documentation. But it was her social media activity that revealed just how far Karen was willing to go. I had created fake accounts on the neighborhood apps and community Facebook groups, using the same digital surveillance techniques I employed in federal investigations. What I found was a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to turn the entire community against me. Karen was posting daily updates about the suspicious newcomer, who refused to follow community standards and would not provide adequate information about his background. She shared photos of my house taken from public streets, circling alleged violations with red arrows and dramatic captions like, "Is this the kind of neighbor we want in our community?" Her posts were getting traction. Neighbors who had never spoken to me were commenting with their suspicions and concerns. Karen was building a narrative that painted me as a potential threat to community safety, someone who might be engaged in illegal activities or worse. Government work could mean anything, she wrote in one particularly inflammatory post. We have a right to know if dangerous individuals are living among our families. The conspiracy theories grew more elaborate with each passing day. Karen suggested that my irregular schedule and tactical-looking vehicle were evidence of criminal activity. She questioned why someone would choose to live in such a quiet neighborhood unless they were trying to hide something. But it was her private messages that revealed the true extent of her plan. Tom Bradley had managed to gain access to Karen's inner circle of supporters, presenting himself as someone who shared her concerns about my presence in the neighborhood. Through him, I learned that Karen was not content with social pressure and HOA violations. She was planning something much more dramatic. "We need to make an example," Karen had written in a group message to her closest allies. "If we let him get away with this disrespect, it sends a message to the whole neighborhood that our authority means nothing." Karen had reached out to what she claimed were law enforcement contacts who could help her deal with the suspicious newcomer problem. She was telling people that she had inside information about my background, that her sources had confirmed I was involved in something illegal. None of it was true, of course, but Karen had learned that in the age of social media, truth was less important than perception. If enough people believed her story, it became real regardless of the facts. The breaking point came when Tom forwarded me a message that made my blood run cold. Karen had found actors. She had posted on a local theater group's Facebook page, looking for people willing to participate in what she called a neighborhood safety demonstration. The post was carefully worded to avoid explicitly stating illegal intent, but the implication was clear. Karen wanted to stage some kind of confrontation that would publicly humiliate me and establish her dominance once and for all. The responses to her post were enthusiastic. Several community theater actors were interested in what they thought was some kind of educational performance about neighborhood safety. They had no idea they were being recruited for Karen's elaborate revenge fantasy. Over the following weeks, I watched Karen's plan take shape through careful surveillance and intelligence gathering. She was organizing what she called a citizens' intervention, where community members would confront me about my violations and demand compliance with neighborhood standards. But Karen's ambitions went further than a simple confrontation. She wanted to create a spectacle, something that would be recorded and shared throughout the community as proof of her power and authority. She was planning to have me arrested. Not by actual police, of course. Karen did not have that kind of influence, despite her claims about law enforcement connections. Instead, she was recruiting actors to pose as officers, complete with costumes and prop badges, who would stage a fake arrest for HOA violations. The plan was breathtakingly illegal and incredibly stupid, but it was also perfectly in character for someone who had spent years believing her fantasy about having real authority over other people's lives. Karen had found 3 actors willing to participate in what they thought was a neighborhood safety education program. She had purchased realistic-looking police costumes online, complete with fake badges and prop handcuffs. She had written a script that would allow the fake officers to arrest me for multiple HOA violations, while she recorded everything for posterity. The plan was set for a Saturday morning in mid-November. Karen would create a pretext to get me outside. The fake officers would arrive and stage the arrest, and the entire neighborhood would witness Karen's ultimate victory over the troublemaker who had dared to challenge her authority. What Karen did not know was that impersonating a police officer is a federal crime. What she also did not know was that conspiracy to deprive someone of their civil rights under color of law is an even more serious federal crime. And what she did not know was that she was about to commit those crimes against someone who had spent 15 years putting people in federal prison for exactly those kinds of offenses. I could have stopped her plan at any point. I could have called local police, filed complaints, or simply confronted her directly about what she was planning. But I decided to let Karen dig her own grave. Sometimes the best way to catch a criminal is to let them commit the crime while you watch and document everything. November 15th was going to be a very interesting day. The morning of November 15th started like any other Saturday in Maplewood Heights. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, and I was outside raking leaves when Karen made her move. She appeared at the end of my driveway at exactly 10 a.m., accompanied by Mrs. Cromwell and two other neighbors I did not recognize. All four of them were carrying clipboards and wearing matching navy blue polo shirts with official-looking badges pinned to their chests. "We need to discuss your continuing violations of community standards," Karen announced loudly enough for half the neighborhood to hear. "This has gone on long enough." I had been expecting this moment for weeks, and I was ready. Hidden cameras were recording from multiple angles. My phone was streaming everything to a secure cloud server, and I had already notified my federal supervisor about the situation. Whatever happened next, it would be thoroughly documented. "What violations are you talking about?" I asked, playing my part in Karen's elaborate drama. Karen consulted her clipboard with theatrical precision. Failure to maintain approved landscaping standards, repeated parking infractions, and refusal to comply with legitimate HOA enforcement actions. We have documented over 30 separate violations in the past 2 months. The small crowd of neighbors that had gathered was growing larger. Word had spread through Karen's social media network that something significant was about to happen. People were coming out of their houses, walking their dogs a little slower than usual, finding excuses to check their mailboxes. Karen was loving every second of it. "Furthermore," she continued, "your suspicious behavior and refusal to provide adequate information about your background have created legitimate safety concerns for our community. We have reason to believe you may be engaged in illegal activities." That was my cue to look appropriately concerned and defensive, which was not difficult since I was genuinely amazed by the audacity of what Karen was attempting. "That is ridiculous," I said. "I have not done anything illegal." "We will see about that," Karen replied with a smile that made my skin crawl. That was when the fake police car turned the corner. It was quite impressive as far as amateur theater goes. Someone had done a decent job modifying what looked like a retired Crown Victoria to resemble a police cruiser. The paint job was convincing from a distance, and they had even added realistic-looking emergency lights on the roof. The car pulled up to the curb, and 3 men in police uniforms got out. Their costumes were purchased online, but they looked official enough to fool casual observers. Each of them wore a badge, carried handcuffs, and moved with the kind of exaggerated authority that screamed community theater. Karen stepped back to let her hired actors take center stage, pulling out her phone to record what she believed would be her greatest triumph. "Officers, thank you for responding so quickly," she said, addressing the fake cops like she was directing a play. "This is the individual we discussed." The lead actor, a middle-aged man with a poorly fitting uniform, stepped forward and looked at me with practiced sternness. "Sir, we have received reports of multiple violations of community standards and suspicious activity," he announced in a voice that was trying too hard to sound authoritative. "We need you to come with us for questioning." I almost laughed out loud. The performance was so bad that it was painful to watch. Real police officers do not arrest people for HOA violations, and they certainly do not show up because someone called about suspicious activity that amounted to parking at an angle. But I played along, putting on an expression of shock and confusion that was not entirely fake. "This is insane," I said, loud enough for Karen's camera to pick up. "I have not done anything wrong." "That will be determined at the station," the fake officer replied, reaching for his prop handcuffs. "Please turn around and put your hands behind your back." The crowd of neighbors had grown to nearly 20 people now, all watching the drama unfold with fascination and horror. Some of them were enjoying the spectacle, but others looked uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Karen was in heaven. She moved closer with her phone, making sure to capture every angle as the fake officer prepared to place handcuffs on my wrists. "This is what happens when you refuse to follow community standards," she announced to her audience. "Actions have consequences." The handcuffs clicked shut around my wrists, and Karen's smile grew even wider. She had done it. After months of harassment and intimidation, she had finally found a way to publicly humiliate me and demonstrate her power over the neighborhood. What Karen did not know was that I had allowed this to happen. What she also did not know was that every second of her elaborate criminal conspiracy was being recorded by multiple sources and would soon be in the hands of federal prosecutors. And what she did not know was that she had just committed several federal felonies against someone who had the authority to arrest her right back. I looked directly into Karen's camera and smiled. "You have no idea what you just did," I said quietly. Karen's expression flickered for just a moment, but her confidence quickly returned. "I know exactly what I did," she replied. "I protected this community from someone who thinks he is above our rules." The fake officer was starting to look uncomfortable. Something in my tone had penetrated his acting persona, and he was beginning to realize that this situation might not be the harmless theater performance he had signed up for. "Let us go," he said, tugging gently on my arm. That was when I decided the show had gone on long enough. "Actually," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I think we should stay right here." I turned to face Corinne directly, and the expression on my face made her take a step backward. "My name is Deputy U.S. Marshal James Mitchell," I announced, "and you just made the biggest mistake of your life." The silence that followed my announcement was deafening. 20 neighbors stood frozen in place, Corinne's phone still recording, the fake officers looking like deer caught in headlights. Corinne was the first to break the silence, and her reaction was exactly what I had expected. "That is impossible," she said, her voice shaking slightly but still defiant. "You are lying to try to get out of this." I reached into my jacket pocket slowly, making sure everyone could see my movements. The fake officer behind me tensed, but he did not try to stop me. He was beginning to understand that he was in way over his head. My federal credentials case came out of my pocket like a magic trick that revealed the truth behind an elaborate illusion. I held it open for everyone to see, the gold badge catching the morning sunlight like a beacon of actual authority. Deputy U.S. Marshal James Mitchell, Southern District, I said clearly. Badge number 847, and you three gentlemen are under arrest for impersonating federal officers. The transformation in the fake officers was instantaneous and complete. The middle-aged man who had been trying so hard to look authoritative suddenly looked like he was going to be sick. His two companions took involuntary steps backward, their costumes now looking like children's dress-up clothes instead of convincing disguises. Wait, the lead actor stammered. We did not know. She told us this was for a community safety demonstration. We are just actors. We are not trying to impersonate real police officers. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I had memorized years ago. The call was answered on the second ring. This is Deputy Marshal Mitchell. I need immediate backup at 847 Maple Street in Maplewood Heights. I have multiple suspects in custody for impersonating federal officers and conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law. The effect of that phone call on the gathered crowd was electric. Suddenly, everyone understood that this was not neighborhood drama anymore. This was a federal case, with real consequences and real law enforcement involvement. Karen was staring at me like I had just transformed into a completely different person, which, in a way, I had. For months, she had seen me as just another neighbor to be bullied and controlled. Now she was face to face with someone who had genuine authority, someone who could back up his words with actual legal power. This is ridiculous, she said, but her voice lacked the confidence it had carried just minutes before. You cannot arrest people for a simple misunderstanding. This was just a community safety exercise. I turned to address the crowd of neighbors who were watching this unfold like spectators at the most dramatic sporting event they had ever witnessed. For the past 4 months, Karen Hensley has been conducting a systematic campaign of harassment against me and other members of this community, I announced. She has filed false reports, stolen community funds, and now she has committed multiple federal felonies by conspiring to impersonate law enforcement officers. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out a thick folder that I had prepared for exactly this moment. I have documentation of wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to deprive citizens of their civil rights under color of law, and impersonating federal officers. The total value of the fraudulent financial schemes exceeds $50,000, which makes this a felony case with potential sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison. Karen's face went white. For the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely afraid. You cannot do this, she whispered. I was just trying to maintain community standards. I was protecting the neighborhood. By stealing $50,000 from community funds, I asked. By filing false police reports. By hiring actors to stage fake arrests. The sound of sirens in the distance was getting louder, and I could see the first police car turning onto our street. Real police cars this time, with real officers who were responding to a legitimate federal law enforcement request. Everyone who participated in this scheme is going to be arrested and charged with federal crimes, I continued. The actors will probably get lighter sentences since they were deceived about the nature of what they were doing. But Karen, you are looking at serious prison time. The federal backup I had requested consisted of 2 patrol cars from the local police department and an unmarked federal vehicle carrying 2 other U.S. Marshals from my district office. As they pulled up to the scene, The crowd of neighbors began to disperse, suddenly realizing that being close to federal law enforcement activity was not the kind of excitement they had been hoping for. My supervisor, Deputy Chief Marshal Sandra Torres, got out of the federal vehicle and approached the scene with the professional competence that comes from 25 years of law enforcement experience. "Mitchell, what do we have here?" she asked, surveying the fake officers, Karen with her clipboard, and the general chaos of the situation. "Conspiracy to impersonate federal officers, wire fraud, mail fraud, and civil rights violations," I replied. "The suspects are all present and the evidence is documented." Torres nodded and signaled to the local officers, who began the process of taking the fake police actors into custody. Their costumes were removed and bagged as evidence, their prop badges and handcuffs collected as exhibits in what was rapidly becoming a significant federal case. Karen stood in the middle of it all like the eye of a hurricane, watching her entire world collapse around her. Her clipboard fell from her hands and scattered papers across my driveway, violation notices mixing with arrest warrants in a symbolic representation of how completely the tables had turned. "This cannot be happening," she kept repeating, as if saying it enough times would make it true. "This cannot be happening." But it was happening, and it was happening exactly the way it should have from the moment Corinne decided that she had the right to control other people's lives through intimidation, fraud, and fake authority. Justice was finally being served, and it tasted even sweeter than I had imagined. The federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta was a place I had visited hundreds of times over my career, but never as the victim of the crimes being prosecuted. Sitting in the witness stand, looking out at Corinne and her co-conspirators at the defendant's table, felt like the completion of a journey that had started with a simple desire for quiet suburban life. Corinne had aged 10 years in the 6 months since her arrest. The confident, aggressive woman who had terrorized an entire neighborhood had been replaced by someone who looked small and defeated. Her lawyer, a public defender who had drawn the short straw, kept glancing at the mountain of evidence the federal prosecutors had assembled, like he was contemplating a career change. The case had made national news, not because of its complexity, but because of its absurdity. Suburban HOA Queen stages fake arrest against federal marshal had been the headline that launched 1,000 social media jokes and late-night comedy monologues. But sitting in that courtroom, listening to the prosecutor detail Corinne's crimes to the jury, I was not laughing. I was thinking about all the neighbors who had suffered under her reign of manufactured authority, all the families who had been driven from their homes by someone who thought power came from clipboards and violation notices. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showing the systematic theft of community funds, social media posts documenting the harassment campaign, video recordings of the fake arrest attempt, testimony from the actors who had been deceived into participating in Corinne's scheme. The 3 actors received sentences of 18 months each, with credit for cooperation and acknowledgement that they had been victims of Corinne's deception as much as participants in her crimes. They would serve their time at a minimum security facility and would likely be released within a year. Corinne was not so fortunate. Wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, impersonating federal officers, and a dozen related charges added up to a federal sentence of 12 years in prison. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who had seen enough of Corinne's type over her career, made it clear that she viewed this as a case about the abuse of perceived authority. The defendant created a reign of terror in her community, Judge Martinez said during sentencing. She used the pretense of legitimate authority to harass, intimidate, and steal from her neighbors. When that was not enough, she escalated to crimes that strike at the very heart of our legal system by impersonating law enforcement officers. Karen's final words to the court were a rambling, incoherent plea that she had only been trying to maintain community standards. Even facing 12 years in federal prison, she could not accept that she had been the villain in this story. The aftermath in Maplewood Heights was like watching a community emerge from an authoritarian regime. The legitimate HOA board was restructured with proper oversight and transparency. The stolen funds were recovered and returned to community projects that benefited residents. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow who had been one of Corinne's victims, was elected as the new HOA president on a platform of common sense and mutual respect. Tom Bradley, the retired accountant who had helped me document Corinne's financial crimes, volunteered to serve as treasurer with a mandate for complete financial transparency. The Martinez family repainted their house the color they had originally chosen, a warm yellow that looked beautiful against the green of their lawn. The Chens got a second dog, a playful golden retriever puppy that barked joyfully whenever children walked by, and nobody complained about the noise. The neighborhood transformation was remarkable. Without Corinne's constant surveillance and harassment, people began to enjoy their homes again. Neighbors talked to each other over fence lines instead of reporting each other to authorities. Children played in yards without fear that their laughter would result in noise complaints. As for me, I finally got the quiet suburban life I had been seeking. My neighbors knew my profession now, but instead of fear or suspicion, there was respect and gratitude. Parents would nod approvingly when they saw me leave for work, knowing that someone who served justice was part of their community. The irony was not lost on me. Corinne had spent months trying to force me out of the neighborhood because she saw me as a threat to her authority. In the end, she had been right about one thing. I was a threat to her authority because her authority was built on lies, intimidation, and criminal activity. Real authority comes from serving others, not from controlling them. It comes from protecting the innocent, not from preying on them. And it comes from following the law, not from breaking it to satisfy personal vendettas. 6 months after Corinne's sentencing, I was working in my garden on a Saturday morning when Mrs. Patterson walked over from her house next door. She was carrying a plate of homemade cookies and had a smile that reached her eyes. "I wanted to thank you again," she said, offering me the cookies. "Not just for stopping Corinne, but for showing us that we did not have to live in fear." I accepted the cookies gratefully, thinking about how different this conversation was from my first encounter with Corinne at this same spot in my driveway. "We all deserve to feel safe in our own homes," I replied. "That is what real community standards should be about." Mrs. Patterson nodded and started to walk back to her house, then turned around with a mischievous grin. "Oh, and James, your mailbox is 2 inches too far from the curb, but I think we can let it slide this time." We both laughed, and for the first time since moving to Maplewood Heights, I felt like I was truly home. Corinne had taught our community an important lesson, though not the one she had intended. She had shown us the difference between legitimate authority and manufactured power, between serving a community and terrorizing it, between justice and revenge. And in the end, justice had won. It always does if you are patient enough to let it work. The federal prison where Corinne was serving her sentence was about 3 hours away from Maplewood Heights. I never visited her, and I never intended to. But sometimes, when I was having a particularly good day in my peaceful suburban neighborhood, I would think about her sitting in her cell, finally experiencing what it felt like to have someone else control every aspect of her life. That thought always made me smile,